Well, hi, everybody. I'm Marcy Marcusa, and welcome to This is Manitoba. Wherever you're listening to our podcast from, if it's your first time tuning into us here in our Prairie Province in the middle of Canada, or if you're listening from somewhere around the world, it is likely that you know Charlie Kirk's name. Today on our podcast, because we lean into local, we're going to talk about how Charlie Kirk's assassination in the United States is resonating here in Manitoba, why some mourned and others say we should be concerned about the impact it's having here. Also, we're going to lean a little bit into how graphic this was. So the shooting itself, the assassination of the right-wing activist from the United States, Charlie Kirk, happened out in the open on a campus in Utah, and the video of it right away went around online. What's the effect of viewing graphic violence? What does that do to people? What does that do to us or kids or teens? It's all coming up on This is Manitoba. We're going to hear from a woman who lives here in our province. She says she's appalled by the way some Canadian MPs honored Charlie Kirk's death. She says he's not a public official, notable scholar, or humanitarian, and she argues no one should have stood in the House of Commons for Charlie Kirk. She's demanding an apology, in fact, from Premier Wab Kinew here in Manitoba and also from the Prime Minister. But before we get to that, let's go to a vigil. Although Charlie Kirk was killed in the United States, many Manitobans did gather to mourn his death and to be together at a vigil. 1,500 people gathered outside the steps of the Manitoba Legislative building to commemorate the controversial founder of Turning Point USA. At the vigil, both the American and Canadian flags could be seen as supporters lit candles and held them up. Charlie Kirk was killed on September 10th, the vigil happening less than a week later on September 16th. CBC Manitoba's Rosanna Hempel was in the crowd. She spoke to people like Lisa Chenier about why, as a Manitoban, she wanted to be there.
It was so emotional to see what had happened last week. Charlie was one of those guys, whether you agreed with him or not, that just impacted youth across the world. My daughter's youth, my son's a young man, and it was important to come out today to say, you know what, conversation can happen peacefully. It didn't happen peacefully last week. He was using venues like the university to spread, in my opinion, and maybe not everybody's opinion, the truth. And it ended up in devastation. And I don't want the kids to fear going out and perhaps speaking about something that they're passionate about. So it's about so many things, but ultimately about the freedom of just speech and peaceful conversation. So we came out for that. Yeah.
Do you mind me asking how old your kids are?
My daughter is 13 and my son's 21.
Okay.
So.
And if it's okay asking, how did you talk to them about what happened last week?
When we found out, it was shocking and confusing and emotional, and I wanted to make sure that they were okay. Everybody responds to something like this so differently, and I just wanted to give them the space to express how they were feeling. And I think everybody went through the same emotion: confusion, shock, anger, sadness. And then, you take those few days to kind of let it sink in. And they were really good about it, and I think them and their friends too had open conversations, and everybody sits on either side of the spectrum about it. But at the end of the day, I think most people just agree that it was awful. It was horrific. So, open dialogue at the end of the day, Yeah.
And is it encouraging to see so many people out here in Winnipeg?
It's so nice. Yeah, there's so many faces all across Manitoba to come out and be together and just be with each other. It's really special.
About his messages resonated with you?
Basically everything what he said and what he lived for. Because some people accuse him of saying some things, but they didn't listen to full Charlie Kirk. They didn't listen to full segment or the full whatever the debate that he had. They didn't listen to the whole thing. They just pick a line and they run with it and they just nail him. And everything that people are accusing him that whatever he is, it's not true if they listen to the whole debate what he was debating about. And he was a man that he was a strong family person. He demonstrated that in his life, and he was about the message of God.
That was the CBC's Rosanna Hempel, one of our Manitoba reporters here. She was speaking with Nate Rupchand and Lisa Chenier, who were in the vigil crowd for Charlie Kirk on September 16th here in Manitoba at the Legislative Building. I'm Marcy Marcusa. Thanks for being with us on today's podcast. This is Manitoba. If it's your first time with us, we do have new episodes dropping every Friday. So thanks wherever you're joining us from, and you can continue to find us wherever you get your favorite podcasts. Well, let's look deeper at the local reaction to Charlie Kirk's death. He was, as we mentioned, a right-wing activist. He was the head of Turning Point USA. He was also the host of his own self-titled podcast where he shared his views on topics like gun control, abortion, and immigration. And he often spoke about diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. That's going to be important to our next interview. So they're often called DEI, right? Here's a clip of Kirk talking to a person at a rally earlier in 2025 about DEI, and awarding what you're about to hear could be offensive.
Here's what's upsetting to me, Heather, is if I'm dealing with somebody in customer service who's a moronic black woman, I wonder, is she there because of her excellence, or is she there because of affirmative action? It almost creates thought patterns that are not necessarily wholesome. It creates resentment, doesn't it, Heather? This is not a way to design society.
That's a clip of Charlie Kirk from a podcast in 2025, before, of course, his death. Now, following his assassination, Prime Minister of Canada, Mark Carney, and Manitoba Premier Wab Kinew issued statements. They condemned the violence, they extended condolences. And then some members from the Liberal and Conservative parties stood up in the House of Commons after Alberta MP Rachel Thomas praised Kirk's legacy and spoke about the importance of hearing differing views and freedom of speech. Zilla Jones says that act, the MPs standing up in Canada in our House of Commons, in her words, made a mockery of our democracy. She is a Manitoba criminal defense lawyer. She, in fact, sent a letter to Premier Wab Kinew in Manitoba and to the Prime Minister. She says as a black woman, she finds it all very disappointing. Here's my conversation with her.
Good morning, Marcy. Nice to be here.
What was the nature and the focus of what you said in your letter?
I was very concerned about the fact that both our provincial and especially our federal government, with the standing ovation, have essentially reframed what was the death of a private citizen in the United States who held no elected office, was not any kind of humanitarian or scholar or artist or any kind of figure of note. He had a podcast and he was a Trump lobbyist, Trump supporter, and yet he gets all these accolades from government members that were not given in other situations, such as when a Democratic representative was murdered in her home 3 months ago in the United States, who was a government figure. We haven't had that kind of response to school shootings in the United States. We haven't had that response to people in our own country that have died in various circumstances. So I was completely confused and disappointed as to why our members of parliament need to stand up in a standing ovation, not just to political violence or freedom of speech, but to the wording of Rachel Thomas, who made the motion. Mr. Kirk was characterized as an advocate for faith, family, and freedom. That is what they stood up and applauded.
Because you used the term standing ovation a couple of times, I've seen the video, and I just want to make clear, not everyone stood. There were some MPs remained seated, but there were...
The NDP did not. I think Chrystia Freeland did not. Some Liberals did not, but a vast majority did.
Why did that bother you personally?
As I said, I think that the person they were standing and applauding is not a person that deserves applause. The person they are standing and applauding said and did many hateful things. They were an advocate for violence. So if we are talking about political violence, I agree that that is a terrible thing. Mr. Kirk advocated for people arming themselves and carrying guns. He said that he didn't care if people died in school shootings because it was a price to pay that was reasonable in order to preserve Second Amendment rights. He was very callous towards the deaths of children in schools. He said that white citizens should arm themselves and make militias against the Great Replacement, which is people of color coming to the United States, essentially to, quote, replace white people as he saw it. And yes, political violence is bad, but it is exactly people like Mr. Kirk and Mr. Trump who invoke political violence, who thrive on political violence. We see the January 6th riots were very violent. Mr. Kirk sent busloads of youth to those riots. And so if we're concerned about political violence, we should not be applauding somebody who made their career essentially supporting political violence. And moreover, we shouldn't be applauding somebody who said many racist, homophobic, sexist, anti-Semitic, Islamophobic, anti-everybody statements. So if we really want to do something about political violence, we should be standing against that kind of rhetoric that Mr. Kirk engaged in. And that would be a better statement to make. So if that's what they want to say, then they should be denouncing his rhetoric at the same time that they denounce political violence, not denouncing it, but leaving it open to honor and even canonize him.
As you know, there was a vigil here I mentioned in Winnipeg Tuesday. There were 1,500 people there at the Ledge. What did you think of the turnout when you saw it?
It's disappointing that there's 1,500 people in this community that felt that this was something they should come out to a vigil for. However, I do take some hope from the fact that it was only 1,500 people. So we know that the religious right is very organized, and this is what they were able to get from their organizing. When we think of the riot, or not the riot, but the protest that was held at the Manitoba Legislature in 2020 for the death of George Floyd, the Black man who was murdered by Minneapolis police, there were 10 to 15,000 people there. And that was during COVID, when we technically were under restrictions not to even be there. So more may have come if not for that they may have had health concerns and not come out. And we had at least 10 times more the people at that protest or that event than we had at the Charlie Kirk event. So I do think there are still more people in this community that are of goodwill and want peace and want to build bridges than there are people that want to divide. But it's still disappointing that the event even happened in terms of the Charlie Kirk vigil.
CBC News was there covering it, and people at the vigil for Kirk. He was called a, quote, martyr. He was also called by David Zacharias, who was in the crowd and CBC spoke with. He was compared to the late Billy Graham and Martin Luther King Jr., both of who were preachers. What concerns you about the division that this could amplify in our province?
Well, I think that there is a lot of division that is coming from this type of rhetoric. So, I mean, when you played the clip from Charlie Kirk, things are being used as wedge issues, things like, quote, DEI, which means diversity, equity, inclusion. And I can talk about that and what that really is and how it's being misrepresented and presented to people as if their enemy or their threat are other people in their community. So we are not threatened by immigrants. We are not threatened by people who are a little bit different than us in the way that they look or their religion or the way they live. The threat is coming from much bigger forces. So we are looking at the United States government being co-opted by billionaires. We are looking at a loss of democracy. We are looking at the creep of authoritarianism. That's the bigger threat. And when we focus on things like DEI and affirmative action and transgender pronouns and all these other wedge issues and culture wars, it distracts from the real issue, which is the declining standard of living and the declining power politically that we all have. And so we need to be united against that rather than being divided by these kind of issues and this kind of rhetoric.
On Facebook, you wrote, quote, the people who bear the cost of free speech are minorities and vulnerable groups, which reiterates what you're outlining here. What reaction did you have when you were publicly sharing your views about Charlie Kirk?
Yeah, so I mean, that is very true that as Charlie Kirk said, there's a price to pay for gun rights. There's also a price to pay for freedom of speech. And I think this is often something that's overlooked, is that the people that are most often the target of hate speech will be minorities. So people of color, Indigenous people, Jewish people, Islamic people, queer people, we are the ones that have to take all this hate. So anytime I do speak out about something like this, I do get hate and I do get threats. And so I certainly have received that.
If we were to have a frank discussion in Manitoba, where we live, about Charlie Kirk and the entirety of his legacy, and an entirety of I think legacy is the right word. He's been killed. He's left behind what he said. What would that look like to you?
Well, I think it begins by being honest. So, what a lot of people have been getting in trouble for, especially in the US, is for simply repeating what Charlie Kirk said, like the clip that you played. And they're getting pushback that, oh, you're taking out of context. He didn't mean that. He wasn't a hateful person. So, I think we need to be honest about who he was and what he said and why he said it.
Why was it important to you, or why did you agree to speak to us publicly on CBC about it, Zilla?
Well, I think it's really important, I think, to change the channel a little bit on this conversation. So as I said, we have got a little bit stuck into going back and forth about, was Charlie Kirk good? Was he bad? Should he have been shot? Should he not have been shot? No, obviously he shouldn't have been shot. Let's, get that part straight. But I think it's very important that we, as I said, unify together as a province, as a nation, as a people, and that we understand that we're stronger together, that our neighbors are not our enemies. We shouldn't be losing friends over this. I've lost friends over this, and I find that heartbreaking, because I think that we should always be able to continue to talk to each other, to continue to love each other, to continue to hold each other up. If we really want to tackle it, we need to look at the kind of rhetoric and the kind of tactics that are coming from that part of politics. So we need to push back and build a better politics, one that is hopeful, one that brings people together, one that uplifts people, one that makes people's lives better.
Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
That was Manitoba criminal defense attorney Zilla Jones weighing in on Charlie Kirk's death and the local reaction in Manitoba. Well, on the podcast finally today, we're going to take a wider view about the impact of what happened in the United States, because one of the things that occurred was video moving very quickly all across the internet. In the moments after U.S. activist Charlie Kirk was shot, that video of his actual assassination was everywhere. And any kid with a phone could see what happened in graphic detail. It is something that is becoming almost commonplace to see violent imagery online, but repeated exposure to it has an impact on all of us. Laura Cavanagh is a registered psychotherapist and professor of behavioural sciences over at Seneca College. She spoke about that aspect of the story with CBC Manitoba's Marjorie Dowhouse.
Thank you so much for joining me today, Laura.
Thanks so much for having me.
What was your first thoughts here when you heard that this video was out there for anyone to see?
Yeah, I felt really deeply saddened, especially because I found out that my own child had watched it, my youngest, who's only 15, and like many people, watched it without seeking it out. So it was shared in a group chat, and they didn't know what they were clicking on. It's quite disturbing to hear and to be made aware, I guess, of how easy it is to access violent content online. Um, you know, we know we have the data is really unequivocal on that consuming violent content affects us, and it affects children and teens even more than it affects adults. And that it has the potential to cause some pretty serious psychological injury.
Laura, this incident, of course, is getting a lot of attention, but it's certainly not the first disturbing thing that many people have seen on the internet. What is the impact of viewing images or video like this?
Yeah, so it does a few things. So the first is that it desensitizes us. So we become more numb. And that's not just sort of up here, not just sort of an intellectual reaction, but actually like our bodies react less. We don't have the same fear response, the same disgust response, the same kind of recoil effect. It also affects our normative beliefs about violence. So the more violent content we consume, the more we sort of overgeneralize the amount of violence that's out there, right? And that can lead people to behave more aggressively because they feel that it's more normative and accepted than it is, or it may lead people to feel very afraid because they feel like the world is more dangerous than it is, or they're more likely to be exposed to it in the real world. It also changes our thinking. So when people consume violent content, they become their cognitions become more aggressive, so we think more aggressively. And then for some people, that's going to translate into behaving more aggressively. We know for sure, with kids and teens, there's some very solid data on how consuming violent media affects their behavior, both in the short and the long term. With some longitudinal studies covering like up to 17 years and seeing like a pretty reliable effect there. I think the key is like, I think often what people think about is is it going to make me behave violently? If I'm not going to be violent, then it's not affecting me, right? But like when we talk about trauma or vicarious trauma, it often doesn't, it sort of depends on your personality, how it manifests. Like it may make you more hostile or irritable, but it may make you feel hopeless or cynical, may make you want to withdraw. It may lead you to self-medicate more. It may lead you to be unable to enjoy activities you used to enjoy. So for all of us, it affects us, and especially when we're engaging with it in a really passive way, different than say, a detective solving a crime.
So, Laura, I mean, some social media sites, they did attempt to take this video down, but it's still widely available. And some people, as you said, didn't mean to see it, and it just may have come up in their social media feeds. From your perspective as a mental health expert, then, what needs to be done to address this problem?
Yeah, it's our mental health is sort of a shared responsibility between ourselves and society or mental health practitioner. I do appreciate that there's some effort being made by social media sites to not just address this video, but to kind of address violent content in general. On the other hand, I think it is going to be difficult to wait for social media companies to just kind of do the right thing, because this is how they make money, and we know that the more outraged someone is, the more upset, the more emotionally charged they feel, the more time they're gonna spend online, and the more clicks they're gonna give, So I think it's really important to be mindful about it. To really think of this as, if as I consume this causes some kind of injury, and I need to think about what the antidote to that is. I think it's also important to do what we can to kind of manipulate our own feeds, to seek out positive content, because that will kind of get amplified back to you, based on your algorithm. What I said for my son who watched it is like, we need to do something that's in the opposite direction. We need to do something that's like uplifting, because what you saw is very disturbing and very dark, and that affects us.
Laura, I really do appreciate you joining us on the show today. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks so much for having me.
That's the CBC's Marjorie Dowhouse from here in Manitoba in conversation with Laura Cavanagh, who's a registered psychotherapist and professor of behavioural sciences at Seneca College. Well, that brings us to the end of our podcast today as we continue to try to make sense of the world and make sense of things as they develop in Manitoba. Thank you so much for leaning into This is Manitoba. I'm Marcy Marcusa. If it's your first time in the podcast, we hope it won't be your last time leaning in. And remember, you can find us wherever you get your favorite podcasts.